Growing native flowers is no bed of roses. It's labour intensive from sunrise to sunset. It's at the mercy of the weather. It's spring, summer, autumn, winter. Brian Parry's ancestral line pretty much founded Australia's commercial native flower industry. More than 100 years later, the family's latest flower grower keeps looking beyond the current trends, treading that fine line between tradition and innovation.
My name is Brian Parry. I trade as Parry's Wildflower Nursery. I grow wildflowers at a farm I have at Bunyah. In 1905, my uncle and grandfather took up land at Carryong. They started to cultivate Australian wildflowers, and they were accepted as being the first people to commercially cultivate Australian wildflowers. And in the early 1940s, there was a law passed where it was illegal to carry native plants or flowers on public transport. And the next move that was afoot was to totally ban the sale of them. And my parents were earning their living at that stage, and they went to the politicians with the idea that instead of banning the sale, they should licence people who had them in commercial quantities. Both sides of the government agreed totally with my parents' idea, and we got licence number one. Now, Australian native plants and flowers are grown throughout the world. As far as the commercial going, there are more grown overseas than there are in Australia, but I think they played a very important role in making plants and flowers available to not only Australia but to the world. When I was a kid, I always liked growing things, and of course it naturally came through that I followed the wildflower thing. I've always liked the bush. I took over my dad's business in 1972. I increased the range and I used the industrial farming methods, plenty of artificial fertilisers, there's a spray for everything. And I always would like to follow the organic principles, but couldn't put figures to it all. I heard about this biologically assisted farming. I liked the idea of it, so I did the course and I've basically followed the principles since. Using biological assisted farming, you're actually using the microorganisms that exist in the soils, and you multiply them and you encourage them in many ways by having organic matter in the soil, for one thing. Work with nature and not against it. You get good results, but you're not interfering too much with the natural environment. I use a lot of composts and I make compost teas. If I do have to use chemical fertilisers, I use them more often in smaller quantities. I always follow a chemical spray with a biological spray to put all the goodies back that I may have killed, and that just seems the way to go. Yeah, there are challenges.
Will you run out of water, Brian?
I will go very close to running out of water in about another 2 months if we don't get a few inches of rain.
Right.
We set up the worm farm basically because my wife wanted to have another sideline business, and when she had that idea I thought, you beaut, I can use the worm castings and I can use the worm juice. The tank is pumped through, it keeps circulating for 3 weeks, and I end up with about 600 litres. Probably the reason why nearly all the plants are still alive.
Thanks to the worm weed.
Worm castings are about the richest form of fertiliser you can get. It certainly improves the health of our farm and grow very healthy flowers as well.
So how many worms in here?
Every 3 months we harvest the beds and reset them and put 20 kilos back in. Within 3 months that should multiply to be 60 kilos. We harvest the worms about 100 kilos every 3 months, and we send them off to a wholesaler where the guy up there packages them off in the little spots and sends them all over Australia. We put a certain amount of the worms back into the new beds. In the 3 months they'll usually triple their numbers. They're pretty tough little beggars. There's always been a good demand for the flowers, even overseas. One time it was mainly the Christmas bush, Christmas bells and Baronias, Waratahs. But there are so many other different ones now, and there are so many different forms too.
You call that, Brian?
Right, this is Acacia macrodinia. It's called a zigzag wattle because it's got a zigzaggy stem, like that. We've probably got over 20,000 plants of the larger growing things, And then probably got about 2,000 or 3,000 in containers. We got about 1,000 of the big flowering grevilleas, 2 different types of banksia, rice flower, some of the different hakeas, a couple of different grevilleas for foliage, 4 different types of eucalypts for foliage, 4 or 5 different types of wattles for foliage, grey flannel flowers and Christmas bells in our shade house. I think that's about the range that we've got. We usually start picking around daylight. Got to knock off at about 10 or 11. It's better for the flower, so off in the cool room and happily rest there until they go off to markets. But people are starting to want to see things or buy things that relate to nature. So I can see a future demand for anything that sort of looks out, come out of the bush. If you get the odd discoloured leaf or a bit of a mark on them, they sort of accept that because that's part of the character of the Australian bush. I like the life I lead. It's a very healthy life, a very independent sort of life. What you get out of it's what you put into it. To come out of a morning, hear the birds. When I first came here, it was open paddocks, crows and magpies are it. And now we have over 50 different species that regularly come to the place. So you walk out of a morning and there's always half a dozen birds chirping away to greet you. Beautiful place to be. I like the fact that I'm growing something that's very Australian. If I happen to take a bunch of flowers somewhere, people look at it and sort of think, gee, I didn't know we had beautiful things like that. But also too, I don't know if anybody doesn't like to get a bunch of flowers. Then you sort of nurture them up to make joy to somebody. It's good to be part of something that started from nothing and has evolved to be what it is now, a worldwide interest, and that's something to be very proud of.
Quite the inheritance, I'd say.